emergency after a bus explodes, 15 people killed in what authorities are calling a terror attack. CNN's Sarah Seidner is in Tunisia right now near the scene. She joins me by phone. Sarah, what do we know?
I can tell you right now, Brooke, basically what's happened is the streets of Tunisia are about to be very, very quiet because a state of emergency was just put in place. And basically people had about an hour to a half an hour to try and get home and get settled because they want the streets completely clear. This happened about an hour and a half ago, where there was an explosion in what we are told was a van that had presidential guards in the van. At least 15 people have been confirmed dead by an official in the Prime Minister's office telling CNN, that this is, they believe, some sort of terrorist attack. They are not sure who is responsible at this time, but they are investigating it as a terror attack.
On the one hand, does art play an important role? Is it as important, say, as getting a degree in economics or becoming a lawyer? And I would argue in some ways it does, because I can't imagine a world without aesthetics. And, even Plato and Aristotle argued for art in terms of I guess this, all art is not beautiful, but beautiful art really is satisfying.
And immigration. Maajid, thank you very much for being here. So your thoughts on President Obama's strategy?
Yes, Megan. I think I would endorse a lot of what we've just heard. Unfortunately, I don't think this current administration has this issue of Islamist extremism correct from day one. It's been from comparing them to the JV team, all the way through to allowing the red line to be crossed in Syria, all the way through to the situation we have today, where just a day before the France attacks, the president stated that ISIS is being contained in Iraq and Syria. The policy from day one has been a policy of obfuscation, denial, and unfortunately a lack of action and a lack of strategy. Now, I don't believe what we're facing, unlike what the Pope mentioned and what King Abdullah endorsed, I don't think we're facing World War III. On the contrary, actually, what I think we're facing is a global jihadist insurgency. And how an insurgency differs from a traditional war is that insurgencies, by definition, rely upon a certain level of support within the communities that they're seeking to recruit from. And as we know with ISIS, 6,000 fighters have gone and joined the worst terrorist group that we've ever known in modern times from Europe. Now, that 6,000 doesn't appear in a vacuum. Those 6,000 weren't radicalized overnight. I'd go so far as to say ISIS didn't radicalize those 6,000 who joined them. ISIS plucked the low-hanging fruit. They were already radicalized.
But to those in the administration who would have us believe, it's just it's a smattering of people. They're based mostly in Syria, and we're after them in Syria. What say you?
No, absolutely, it's incorrect. Those 6,000 that joined ISIS in Europe, ISIS plucked the low-hanging fruit, and the reason they were already radicalized is because for decades in Europe, we have Islamist groups working within Muslim communities who've been busy radicalizing Muslims in Europe. I know I was one of those they radicalized. They've been proselytizing and preaching the idea or the notion of resurrecting a theocratic caliphate. So along come ISIS 10, 15 years later and declare that they've established this caliphate. People had already been primed and in anticipation for the return of this so-called caliphate. In surveys, 33% of British Muslims have sympathy for the notion of resurrecting a caliphate. So we're not looking at ISIS as the main problem. We're not even looking at this now defunct term that the State Department used to say.
Radical Islam. I want to talk to you about that, because the president says, and his supporters, Hillary Clinton, we don't say radical Islam. It's just going to alienate mainstream Muslims. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think actually, there's a danger that if we don't name this thing Islamist extremism and isolate it from mainstream Muslims and then undermine it, on the contrary, exactly what the State Department is hoping to avoid will be brought about. Because, when we don't name something, the vast majority of people that don't really understand these complex conversations will assume the problem is with the religion of Islam and Muslims themselves. It's only by naming it that we're able to isolate it from mainstream Muslims and say the problem isn't Islam. The problem is Muslims Muslim theocracy. The problem is Islamist extremism, those who wish to impose a version of Islam over society. Now, this idea that it's got nothing to do with Islam is as preposterous as saying it's got everything to do with Islam. The truth is, Megyn, it's got something to do with Islam. That something is the fact that Islam is being politicized. It has been for decades within our communities. And it's about time we recognize that, named the problem, isolated it from mainstream Muslims, and then all of us together, Muslims included, but everyone else as well, it's all of our responsibility to then go about challenging this ideology and undermining it.
And I am a bit disheartened, to have nothing said. I recall during major international events, on the world front and current events, which I remember in school, back to public school, you had to do current events. And sure, when you were real young, you probably could bring in a Peanuts comic and read that. But soon, at grade 2 or 3, you were expected to bring in articles and read, within some context, globally or locally, the news. And I think that's something that we don't take enough time, maybe in the day, to reflect upon what's current. Who knows where people are getting their source material from now?
Yeah.
I think they're getting it from selected social media sites that tailor towards one event. Even the ads that come up when you open CNN, it's going to be different than the ads that show up when I open CNN, because they've also already profiled our website to find out what's of interest. So I guess if you're really looking for it, you'll find it. But the significance of your artwork, you might find dropping ego very important to continue.
Lines in the sand, seen from the air. The Russian Air Force says this cockpit footage shows columns of oil tankers in Syria belonging to the so-called Islamic State. They've bombed them intensively, part of an international effort to target the group's supply lines and sources of finance. On the ground, IS has proved surprisingly resilient. This was an earlier recruiting video, but it is getting harder for recruits to join them from Europe. And as the airstrikes take their toll, IS is expanding its efforts to launch terrorist attacks around the world. New York City has been implicitly threatened in a recent IS video. It talked of suicide attacks there and in other Western cities, but the authorities say there's no evidence of an imminent attack.
I want to encourage all New Yorkers to continue to go about their business normally. It's important to note that there is no credible and specific threat against New York City.
And from Syria to the other side of the world, in Honduras, 6 Syrians have been arrested at the capital's airport with false Greek passports, 5 of them trying to get into the United States. No evidence yet of terrorism, but when a Greek consular official showed up, reportedly none of them could speak Greek.
They had false documents, some passports that are going to be investigated. They were stolen in Greece, and later they were detained. It's an investigation that was carried out through specialist intelligence officers as well as Interpol.
And in Paris, a massive investigation continues into last Friday's attacks. One key question still unanswered is whether the plotters planned the massacre using encrypted communications that French intelligence could not intercept. Frank Gardner, BBC News.
I was more welcome to that because I couldn't find a way for visual arts to have meaning in grad school, just purely aesthetically, so I took an economic perspective, and economics, she quickly pointed me towards Marxist theory and writings of Engels and Marx, so I got into kind of a socialist perspective. She even got me so far to sign up for the International Socialists, which is a movement, INS, which strangely enough was the immigration Homeland Security named INS when I came to America. That was coincidental. But international socialism was certainly aware that national socialism doesn't work. And so I found myself gravitating away from anything of personal or egotistical importance or development as an artist, which I'd been doing for a few years before going back to grad school, into trying to find a voice that mattered. And then I found out very quickly the voice of the artist didn't have a lot of say in that situation. It got to the point that perhaps I would be better served being another person carrying a very similar banner or wearing a similar button just for mass numbers. And even though you might have had some very artistic skills tied towards whatever craft you wanted to do, fabrication or building or language or color, or unless it was tied to maybe design of information, unless it had a role in that, you weren't really applied. And so you started to realize there were groups of artists that were started working much more as socialists or social agents or movements, and they moved away from visual arts and moved into a realm of political significance. And certainly at that time I started to turn on to that essay that I think I've shared with you, New Genre Public Art, Mapping the New Terrain, which came out. And I think that text really, the cover of it says it all. It's art needs to move beyond making matter and actually making matter matter.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Overseas for more than a week, but well aware of a fearful nation back home, President Obama sounded more like a leader at war.
Our coalition will not relent. Destroying ISIL is not only a realistic goal, we're going to get it done, and we're going to pursue it with every aspect of American power and with all the coalition partners that we've assembled. It's going to get done.
At a news conference in Malaysia, the president once again defended his strategy for defeating ISIS. But instead of brushing off questions about his policy as he did last week, he acknowledged Americans are deeply worried.
That we're not afraid to not elevate them, to somehow buy into their fantasy that they're doing something important. They're a bunch of killers. And we fight them. And we beat them.
The president said he just may be able to join forces with Russian President Vladimir Putin to wipe out the terror group after the attacks in Paris and on the Metrojet airliner.
I discussed with President Putin in a brief pull-aside his need to recognize that he needs to go after the people who killed Russian citizens.
And he called on Americans to show compassion to the thousands of Syrian refugees he wants to welcome into the U.S., despite poll numbers showing Americans are resistant to the idea.
Refugees who end up in the United States are the most vetted, scrutinized, thoroughly investigated individuals that ever arrive on American shores.
The president also appeared to have choice words for Donald Trump.
I want surveillance of these people.
And the GOP frontrunner's proposals to conduct more surveillance on Muslims in the U.S.
We must absolutely reject that we are somehow at war with an entire religion. Prejudice and discrimination helps ISIL.
Knocked back on his heels after his initial response to the Paris attacks was widely panned, the sometimes more cerebral president ended this foreign trip speaking from the gut, urging Americans to avoid giving in to fear.
Hello. How are you all doing?
A point he punctuated with a stop to a refugee center in Malaysia, a visit Mr. Obama reflected on as he left the country.
If you were a parent and you saw those kids and you thought about what they had gone through, the notion that we couldn't find a home for them anywhere in the United States of America, that is contrary to our values.